The cold stone pressed against his cheek like the hand of death itself, rough and wet with the condensation of centuries. Thomas could barely open his eyes. The weight of the night clung to him like a curse, the iron chains on his wrists numbing his hands to the bone. Somewhere beyond the silence, a drop of water fell from the ceiling and echoed through the chamber. That single sound was enough to remind him he was alive but forgotten. In that dungeon, time had no meaning, only pain, only regret, only memory. The thought that his family might never know the truth about why he was here, that they might believe the lies, was worse than the frost in his veins. He closed his eyes and saw his wife's face, her gentle hands on their daughter's hair, and his heart broke all over again. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It had not always been this way. Just weeks before, Thomas had been a respected mason in the bustling town of Wexford, known for his steady hands and honest work. He built walls that stood straight against storms, repaired church steeples that rang clear on holy days, and gave his word like stone, unshakable. But in a world where men clung to honor like shields and grudges like daggers, a single whisper could destroy a life. That whisper came from Edward, the Lord's steward, whose envy of Thomas's skill and quiet dignity festered like rot. The accusation had been simple but devastating. Thomas had stolen coin from the castle stores. One bag of silver missing. No witnesses, no proof, just Edward's word and the discovery of the pouch near Thomas's cart. His protests of innocence fell on deaf ears. A mason was just a craftsman. A steward, a man of trust. And so, in the chilling dawn of late autumn, Thomas was dragged from his home, his wife Eleanor weeping, their daughter Margaret clutching her doll in silence, her eyes wide with fear. The dungeon was a pit carved into the earth beneath the castle. No fire, no straw, only stone and shadows. The jailer barely glanced at Thomas as he shoved him into the cell and locked the door with a clang that echoed like the ceiling of a coffin. The days bled into one another, measured only by the faint shaft of gray light that slipped through a crack high above. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst burned his throat, but it was the memory of his family that tormented him most. Eleanor had begged the steward, had even knelt before the Lord himself, but Edward's lies were honeyed and poisonous. "The mason is guilty, my lord," he had said with practiced sorrow. "We must make an example. If even the humble steal from your coffers, what message does that send?" And so Thomas was left to rot. Yet even in the darkness, a secret flickered. For Eleanor knew her husband's heart, and Margaret, though only 9, had seen Edward the night the silver went missing. She had woken from a dream and wandered to the window, where she saw the steward slipping into the courtyard with a small sack. She hadn't understood it then, but when the accusations came, the truth took root in her memory. She told her mother, who held her close, whispering that they must be careful, that even truth could be dangerous when spoken against the powerful. The weeks that followed were filled with silent struggle. Eleanor gathered her courage and began speaking to others, quietly, carefully. The blacksmith owed Thomas his life after a scaffolding collapse Thomas had prevented. The baker remembered Thomas mending his oven's stone arch without asking a coin. Slowly, whispers of doubt began to spread about Edward's story. But fear ruled men's tongues, and none dared to speak openly against a steward who feasted at the Lord's table. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Thomas faced his own torment. The freezing nights stiffened his joints, the damp walls chilled his breath, and his thoughts turned often to despair. Yet in the quietest moments he prayed, not for his own release, but for Eleanor and Margaret to be spared shame, for them to find strength in his absence. He replayed memories like fragile treasures, Eleanor's laugh beneath the apple tree in spring, Margaret's tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb as a baby. He clung to those recollections as though they could warm his body against the stones. Then, one night, a sound came that shattered the monotony, the scrape of a key in the lock. Thomas sat upright, his chains rattling. The door opened slowly, and the torchlight revealed a figure cloaked in shadow. It was Eleanor. She had bribed the jailer with the last of her jewelry, a simple silver brooch that had been her mother's. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but her resolve burned bright. "Thomas," she whispered, rushing forward to touch his face, though the cold chains held him back from embracing her fully. "I will free you. I swear it." The truth is coming to light, his eyes filled with tears he could not wipe away. "Eleanor, no. You mustn't risk yourself. Think of Margaret." "I am thinking of her," she replied fiercely. "She knows the truth. She saw Edward that night, and others are beginning to question his lies. You will not die down here." Before he could answer, the jailer coughed impatiently at the door. Time was short. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his, breathing in the scent of stone and sorrow, committing it to memory as though it might be their last moment. "Hold on, Thomas," she whispered. "For us." And then she was gone, the door clanging shut, leaving him with the ghost of her touch lingering on his skin. In the days that followed, the tension in the village grew. The steward's arrogance swelled as he strutted about the marketplace, but behind his back, murmurs spread like wildfire. Margaret, though young, repeated her story to the blacksmith's wife, who passed it to the miller, who told it to the shepherd, until it became a quiet chorus of suspicion. Yet still, none dared confront Edward openly. The Lord was a man who prized order above all else, and to accuse his steward without proof was to risk ruin. Eleanor understood this. She also understood that the only way to save Thomas was to bring his truth directly before the Lord himself, no matter the danger. And so she began to plan. It was at the feast of St. Martin, when the village gathered in the castle hall to offer thanks for the harvest, that Eleanor chose her moment. The hall was lit with fire and filled with voices, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and spilled ale. Edward stood at the Lord's side, smug and confident, his laughter grating in Eleanor's ears. She clutched Margaret's hand tightly, her heart pounding with fear and determination. When the moment came for petitions, she stepped forward. The hall quieted as she bowed low, her voice trembling but clear. "My lord," she said, "I beg you once more to hear me. My husband is no thief. He has been wronged." A ripple of disapproval ran through the crowd. To challenge the steward so boldly was near treason. Edward's face tightened, his eyes flashing with fury. "My lord, this again? Must we indulge the woman's grief with baseless accusations?" But before Eleanor could answer, Margaret stepped forward, her small voice rising in the silence. "I saw him," she said, pointing at Edward with trembling hands. "The night the silver went missing. I saw him in the courtyard. He carried a sack." Gasps filled the hall. The Lord's gaze darkened, turning to Edward. "Is this true?" he demanded. Edward stammered, his face flushing red. "A child's fancy, nothing more?" But the blacksmith stood then, his great frame towering above the crowd. "My lord, I believe the child speaks truth. Thomas is an honest man. We all know it." One by one, others rose, the baker, the shepherd, the miller, each adding their voice, trembling but resolute. The hall filled with their words, a tide of loyalty to Thomas that could not be silenced. Edward's face grew pale, sweat beading his brow. The Lord's judgment was swift. "Seize him," he commanded. The guards moved, and Edward's protests echoed as he was dragged from the hall. For the first time in weeks, hope surged in Eleanor's chest like fire. But hope, she knew, was fragile. For though Edward's guilt had been exposed, the stain of accusation still lingered. Thomas's release was not yet certain, nor the road to forgiveness clear. And in the dungeon, Thomas himself remained unaware, shivering in the cold, clutching only the memory of his wife's whispered promise. The night deepened, and above the dungeon, the winds howled through the castle towers. Below, Thomas closed his eyes, praying once more, not knowing that destiny was already shifting, that the truth had begun to break its chains, just as surely as he longed to break his own. The dawn after the feast was gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low on the earth and carried whispers of snow. In the dungeon, Thomas stirred weakly, his body stiff and aching, unaware that the world above had changed in the night. He had dreamt of Eleanor again, her voice, her warmth, and when he woke, for a moment he believed he could still feel her near. But the stone and chains reminded him otherwise, and he braced himself for another day of silence and cold. Above, Eleanor's heart burned with both hope and fear. Edward had been seized, but the steward was cunning, and men of his kind always had ways of wriggling free. She knew that her husband's release would not come without one final confrontation. She had risked everything already, her reputation, her safety, even Margaret's innocence, but she could not falter now. She had won a hearing. She still had to win his freedom. The Lord was not a cruel man, but he was cautious. That morning, he summoned Eleanor to the great hall. Margaret clung to her mother's skirts as they entered, the vast stone chamber colder and emptier than it had been the night before. The Lord sat at the high table, his face unreadable, while Edward stood in chains, his fine clothes wrinkled and soiled. His eyes, however, still carried defiance, and when they met Eleanor's, she saw in them a silent vow of vengeance. "My lady," the Lord said, addressing Eleanor in a tone that was both weary and grave, "your words have stirred my people. They believe in your husband's innocence and they cast doubt on my steward. Yet truth is a fragile thing. A child's testimony, the loyalty of neighbors, these are not proof enough to undo justice already passed. And yet," he paused, his gaze sharp, "I would not condemn a man wrongly. I seek more." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had prayed for strength, but here, standing before the man who held Thomas's fate, she felt her knees weaken. Still, she forced herself to speak. "My lord, I ask only that you look at Edward's hands, at the ring he wears." The hall grew quiet. Edward shifted uneasily. "What nonsense is this?" he spat, but Eleanor pressed on. "The silver stolen bore your sigil, my lord, the crest of your house stamped into each coin. Days ago, my daughter saw Edward in the courtyard carrying a sack. She also saw him drop something. It was a coin. She picked it up, thinking it harmless, and brought it to me. I kept it." Gasps rose as Eleanor reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled forth a single silver coin, its surface glinting faintly in the pale light. The crest of the Lord's house was clear upon it. "This coin bears not only the mark of your house," Eleanor said, her voice steady now, "but also a scratch that matches the one on Edward's ring. See for yourself." All eyes turned to Edward, whose face blanched. The Lord leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Bring it here." The guard carried the coin to the table. The Lord examined it closely, then raised his gaze to Edward. "Show me your hand." Edward hesitated, then extended his right hand. Upon his finger gleamed a heavy signet ring, the metal worn and scratched. The Lord placed the coin beside it, and the hall held its breath. The scratch lined up perfectly. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward stammered, words spilling without sense. It is not mine. Someone planted it." The Lord's fist struck the table with such force that the coin leapt. "Enough!" His voice boomed through the hall, final and unyielding. "You have betrayed my trust, stained my name, and condemned an innocent man. You will be judged as a thief and a liar." Edward's struggles were useless as guards dragged him away, his cries echoing down the corridor. Eleanor clutched Margaret close, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The Lord turned his gaze upon her, softer now, touched with something like regret. "Your husband will be freed," he said. "This very hour." The words were a balm, a release, and a wound all at once. Eleanor bowed her head, unable to speak for the flood of relief and sorrow. For though Thomas would be freed, nothing could erase the nights he had suffered in that freezing dungeon. The scars upon his body and spirit. The jailer unlocked the cell with reluctance, as if fearful that justice itself might strike him. The chains fell from Thomas's wrists, and he staggered forward, weak and trembling. Eleanor was there, catching him in her arms. For a moment, time ceased to exist. The cold, the hunger, the injustice all melted into the warmth of her embrace. Margaret threw her small arms around his waist, and Thomas bent his head, pressing his lips to her hair, tears dripping into her curls. "I thought I'd never see you again," he whispered. "You will never lose us," Eleanor murmured fiercely. "Not while we breathe." The days that followed were not easy. Freedom was a gift, but the shadows of betrayal lingered. Thomas struggled with his strength, his hands stiff from frost and chains, his body thinner than it had ever been. At night he woke shivering, haunted by dreams of the dungeon, and Eleanor would hold him until the tremors passed. Margaret, too, bore scars, though hers were quieter, the innocence stripped from her eyes, replaced by the knowledge of how cruel men could be. And yet, life moved forward. The townsfolk, ashamed of their silence, rallied around Thomas and his family. The blacksmith brought meat for their table. The baker brought bread without asking coin. Even the shepherd brought wool to warm them. It was not pity, but penance, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had failed him when he needed them most. Thomas returned slowly to his work, his hands regaining their steadiness, his craft once again shaping stone into strength. But he carried with him a new weight, not of shame, but of resolve. He had seen how quickly lies could destroy, how silence could condemn. He swore to himself that he would never again let fear rule his life, nor let others suffer alone in darkness. Eleanor watched him with both pride and sorrow. She knew the man she had married had been tempered by fire. He was stronger now, but also older in spirit, the light in his eyes touched forever by shadow. Yet she loved him all the more for it, for he had endured and returned to them, scarred but unbroken. Margaret grew into a young woman marked by her father's ordeal. She carried the memory of that night in the great hall, the courage it had taken to speak truth before so many, and it shaped her into someone who valued justice above all else. Years later, when she became a mother herself, she told her children the story of how lies nearly destroyed her family, and how truth, though fragile, had saved them. As for Edward, his name faded from memory, his fate sealed in disgrace. Some said he was banished, others that he died in the very dungeon where Thomas had suffered. But for Thomas and Eleanor, his shadow no longer mattered. What mattered was the life they rebuilt together, the laughter that returned to their home, the warmth of fires shared, the quiet joy of simple days. And still, on cold winter nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the house grew quiet, Thomas would sometimes wake with the chill of stone in his bones. He would rise, wrap himself in a blanket, and sit by the fire, staring into the flames. Eleanor would join him, resting her head against his shoulder, and they would sit in silence. For no matter how much time passed, the memory of the dungeon remained, a scar, a reminder, and a testament to what they had survived. Their story became one told in whispers through the town, of a man wrongfully accused, of a woman's courage, of a child's truth, of a family bound together by love stronger than chains. It was a story of betrayal, yes, but also of forgiveness, of neighbors who failed but later stood tall, of a Lord who listened when it mattered most, of justice that arrived late but still arrived. In the end, it was not the dungeon that defined Thomas, but the love that pulled him from it. And though the nights had been cold, the years that followed were filled with warmth enough to banish even the harshest winter memory. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.